But again, most of my colleagues, they draw different conclusions from this stalemate. They say, now we have to give even more arms to the Ukrainians. Bigger arms, F-16s, long-range missiles. And if we do not do that, then then after Ukraine, other countries may be attacked.
Heinz.
Georgia, Moldavia, even the Baltic states and Poland.
Heinz, you and I, we've been saying since way before the war that Ukraine is a model case of neutrality. Ukraine should be neutralized, just like Austria became neutral in 55. Obviously, this would have been the solution, and a lot of people didn't listen, disagree, and even as Tom says, our colleagues even fight us on that. Why? Why are there so many intelligentsia in Europe who still think that the only solution to the only way to peace is through weapons, as Mr. Stoltenberg says? Why? Maybe let's move forward now to the second part of this discussion, where we want to debate a bit what we are taking away from these two wars that we see going on, which kind of took us by surprise, both of them. Russia, Ukraine, and Israel and Palestine, or the Israeli slaughter against Gaza. We are recording this 20 minutes before Israel is going to take a stand in The Hague, in the Netherlands, and defend in front of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, what it is doing, because it has been accused by South Africa of genocide, and Israel says, no, this is slender. But by now, the carnage in Gaza is just beyond anything that I think any one of us could have imagined 3 months ago. Tom, if you look at what happened between Russia and Ukraine, if you look what's happening between Israel and Gaza, what does this tell us about the situation of world affairs, of world politics, of security in Europe and Asia?
Yeah, it may surprise you because many people regard these wars and say, and conclude the world is in a bad shape. Now, I'm not going to say the reverse, but I think we should be careful. In the longer term, the world is still doing not so bad, even with respect to security. There's still progress. GNP worldwide, on average, is rising every year. Illiteracy is decreasing. We are living longer, also in Africa. So there is progress. There are not many interstate wars either. Besides Ukraine and Russia, not many states are fighting against each other. And we should see the big picture as well. That said, there are nowadays, certainly from the European point of view, two major wars, one in the Middle East, but that's not unusual that there's a war between Israel and the Palestinians. There have been maybe 4 wars in the last 20 years between Israel and Gaza. This is only a new one, and of course, a bigger one with respect to the scale of destruction. But still, in my view, it will end in a couple of weeks or months, and then all the media coverage will be again on Russia, Ukraine. And I leave it to Heinz to go deeper into that Gaza war issue. With respect to Russia, Ukraine, this is, of course, new for Europe. We have a big war on our territory. 500,000 people have either been wounded or died on both sides, according to the New York Times, 500,000. Again, I repeat, this is a nuclear weapon state that is involved against a non-nuclear weapon state, Ukraine. But in my view, this war could have been avoided. The mainstream consensus idea is that there's only one part that should be accused, and that is Russia, and we focus as a laser beam on the president, on Putin. Yeah? But in my view, the West has made mistakes as well in the past.
I share that view, by the way.
That
I share that view in big part. So can you tell me why? What are your accusations in the West?
Yeah, I mean, again, the mainstream idea is that Putin did this because he was frustrated because the USSR became smaller after the end of the Cold War, and now he wants to expand again. It's called expansionism, imperialism by Putin. He's compared to Hitler by some. I don't agree. You know, there are other explanations. One explanation has to do with domestic politics, that he was afraid that democratization from Western Europe to Eastern Europe and then to Ukraine may, yeah, blow over to Moscow, and then these guys have a problem. And so he wants to prevent it. But an even better explanation has to do, in my view, with security, yeah, and perceptions of insecurity, and then more in particular, the fact that we have neglected Russia after the Cold War, and even humiliated by keeping NATO alive and then expanding NATO different rounds in the direction of the East, having promised not to expand NATO.
Yeah? How long will it take? Because this is what Russia has been saying since before the war started. They've been shouting at the top of their lungs, stop it, guys, stop it, guys, stop it, guys. NATO is a problem. And we are not listening. And I'm so angry because it's now 2 years into this war and we're still not listening. Tom, how long is it going to take for the Europeans to finally get the point that this is a threat to Russia when we are threatening them? When Europe threatens Russia, Russia feels threatened. How long will it take them to understand that?
I share your frustration. I don't understand why most of my colleagues and experts and also officials in our countries don't get that point. A point that John Mersheimer is also making already for years, even more than a decade. You know,
Lavrov quotes Mersheimer. You know, saying like, this guy gets it. It's like, what?
So, but I think the mood is changing, of course, because the war is changing. The offensive by the Ukrainians is a failure. The last offensive in the spring, and now we have a stalemate, just like in World War I, 4 months already. So the Ukrainians are not capable, to take back the annexed regions, but also the Russians are probably not capable of getting much more territory either. So there's a stalemate. And that, in my view, that opens the possibility, the opportunity to think about a different option than fighting, namely negotiating. But again, and I see already a solution before me, and we can talk about that. But again, most of my colleagues, they draw different conclusions from this stalemate. They say, now we have to give even more arms to the Ukrainians. Bigger arms, F-16s, long-range missiles. And if we do not do that, then then after Ukraine, other countries may be attacked.
Heinz.
Georgia, Moldavia, even the Baltic states, and Poland.
Heinz, you and I, we've been saying since way before the war that Ukraine is a model case of neutrality. Ukraine should be neutralized, just like Austria became neutral in 55. Obviously, this would have been the solution, and a lot of people didn't listen, disagree, and even as Tom says, our colleagues even fight us on that. Why? Why are there so many intelligentsia in Europe who still think that the only solution to the only way to peace is through weapons, as Mr. Stoltenberg says? Why?
Yeah, I agree entirely with Tom that the real reason is security. And concluding, if you have this interpretation, neutrality would have been an option to avoid the war. So we discussed it already before 2014. If Ukraine would have made clear that it would follow a credible and useful neutrality concept, then of course Russia would have seen Ukraine as a buffer state, by the way, as Finland and Sweden. So that's so still, I think that would have avoided the war. Of course, if you have this interpretation, it's not security, it's imperialism, then you might come to a different conclusion. But let me just add some evidence that imperialism is a very unlikely interpretation, because if you are an imperial state, you need a long-term concept for aggression. And if you look at the arms expenditure by Russia, they decreased after 2016 and remained at a very low level. And it was about 6% of the expenditures of the NATO countries. So if you compare Putin with Hitler, for example, Hitler had an arms expenditures of 2/3 of the European countries at that time. So that there was a long-term plan for aggression. So Russia didn't have this. Russia didn't have it. It's a very low, so it didn't prepare militarily for an imperial expansion. So and when he invaded Ukraine with 180,000 soldiers, so that was very small for a country like Ukraine. So if you compare it, what the US had in 1991 when they expelled Iraq from Kuwait, the US came in with about 800,000 soldiers in a country which is 40 times smaller than the Ukraine. So that was either an entirely military miscalculation or the self-perception was just wrong of Putin. But I don't think he's he is such irrational that he could start an imperial war with so little military preparedness. So that's, I would say, imperialism is really not really a good explanation.
And also the explanation of Putin wanting to stop democratization. And Tom, my main example why that cannot be the case is Mongolia, the other side of Russia. Mongolia has been democratizing beautifully over the last 25 years. You know, they get more and more and more democratic with every round of reforms. And neither to Russia nor to China, this is a problem. As long as these states are no security threats, the big ones, they don't have a problem with democratic states. What they have a problem with is when you actually militarize them against them. Tom, do you see a way out? You were talking about a possible way out now that we're basically in a stalemate. What is a realistic way out?
The only realistic way out, and that applies to any conflict and any war, is that it's solved by talking and sitting around the table by diplomats. Why do we have foreign affairs ministries? Why do we have diplomats? To talk, and then most of these the experts say, but Putin does not want to talk. I read the other way around. I mean, in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, there was an article saying that Putin has said that since September, on many occasions, that he wants a ceasefire and wants talks on peace negotiations. But nobody in Europe, at least, or in the United States, in the West, is trying to get the Russians and the Ukrainians to talk. We simply do not even try. So we do not know whether it works. Now, if we try and if they go to the negotiation table, the final solution, probably, I may be wrong, can be the following compromise, but it will have to be a compromise, like in our conflict. And it's not a lose game for Ukraine and a win game for Russia. Both leaders, Zelensky and Putin, have to be able to sell it to their public opinion. Zelensky he can say, Ukraine remains a sovereign state, be it a bit smaller. It can become a democracy for the third.
And neutral.
Yeah, I will come to that. It will become a democracy, which has never been a democracy. Zelensky can maybe even remain the prime minister if he wins the elections. Then we, the West, have to provide security guarantees, but legally binding or harder than those in the Budapest Memorandum of 94. Ukraine can arm itself, not too much, but they can arm itself. And Ukraine will become part of the Western sphere of influence. And that's something that Putin doesn't like. Yeah, but it will be like that. And in the longer term, Ukraine may become part of the EU. So these are all wins for Zelensky. Yeah? Now, he has to give in on neutrality and NATO membership. So Ukraine cannot become a member of NATO and should become a kind of neutral state, as both of you already have been saying, and me as well. And the Crimea will remain Russian, and the Donbass and the eastern parts of Ukraine depends on the outcome of the negotiations, but I don't expect that Putin will give them back easily. So maybe we have to find a temporary solution and coming back to that part in 15 years' time. And that's something where both parts, I think, can live with that. Now, if Zelensky and Ukraine do not start talking, then the risk exists that Russia will gain more territory.
Yeah, but we also are probably aware that the third part in this equation is Washington. And we know that Russia wants to negotiate with Washington because this war is the hot war is between Kiev and Moscow. The cold war is between Moscow and Washington. Heinz, do you think that the neoconservatives in the United States, that there's people who want now to go toward negotiations because there's still a rationale in the US to keep bleeding Russia dry and do it with the blood of the Ukrainians? And that's what has been going on for the last 2 years. Do you think that this rationale is now changing?
The public mood is changing in Washington, not so much with the neocons, but more or less in the population and also in the government because of the failed counter-offensive of Ukraine. So there is some voices who would say, let's find another solution, maybe on the lines Tom mapped out here. But my hunch is that the result of the war will be Korean stalemate, because we know from history and during the Cold War where the army stand. There will be the political dividing line, and there will be a new iron curtain from the Arctic through Ukraine down to the Black Sea. And since Finland and Sweden are now becoming NATO members, so they will be on the west side, on the NATO side, and Finland will become a front state. So I don't know why Finland exchanged the status of the buffer state through the status of a front state. So it's much less secure now, Finland, than it was before. As the Finnish foreign minister, for example, admitted in an interview recently in CNN. So she said there was no direct threat by Russia, and that was not the real reason why we joined NATO. We wanted to join NATO because we wanted to be the member of the family, the Western family of NATO. That was the main reason. So the war will end like the Cold War or the Korean War. And only after a couple of years, we might have a big peace conference like the Helsinki 75 or the Vienna Congress of 1815, which might bring a better and a long-term solution. So for the moment, the battlefield is decisive. And as Tom said, maybe even there would be an advantage for Russia. That's quite a possibility.
Tom, Heinz has mentioned this new Iron Curtain that might go down in Europe, but even if it does, it would be an Iron Curtain with a lot of way around it. I mean, we've seen that this war in Ukraine has not led to the isolation of Russia that everybody expected, and that the Europeans completely, utterly, misguidedly have been pretending has been going on for 1.5 years, until they recently woke up to the fact that 2/3 of the world are not on the same page as they are, and they keep trading, and the Indians get all the Russian oil for cheap, and they love it, and then they resell it to Europe, and Europe still buys it. So it's like an Iron Curtain without, more like a velvet curtain or something. What do you think is this conflict now doing to the rest of the world that is in neither camp? Are we seeing a strengthening of the non-aligned movement again? Are we seeing something new? What's your interpretation?
Yeah, you're right. This is correct. The sanctions that the EU and the United States has imposed on Russia are not followed, neither by China, India, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East. So who is isolated? I think we are isolated, the EU and the United States, in a certain way. And these global South countries and the BRICS, they have their own reasons for why they are not supporting us. And there are ideological reasons, economic reasons, reasons that has to do with national interests, which is normal. So it's symbolic for how the world is changing, from unipolarity, like unipolarity, to kind of multipolar worlds, in my view. Sometimes it seems that many in the foreign policy establishments in the West do not get that point. Still living in the past. Yeah.
It's also ironic that we still interpret what's going to happen as a new Cold War, which was, of course, a bipolar situation, and it's clearly not going to be bipolar. Clearly not. Heinz, Tom, whoever wants to say something, but what's this new dynamic going to do to Europe? I mean, the Europeans, they're going to suffer. I mean, if they continue this kind of stuff, because the economies that are shrinking is not the Russian economy, not the US economy. Both of them are having a war economy boom. The Europeans are currently really in a bad situation, bad shape.
Yeah, maybe we can just continue on the role of Europe. I think this war in Ukraine should help us think again about what our European interests are. Because the main mistake that has been made in the past, or this NATO expansion, but especially the NATO expansion with respect to Ukraine, in 2008 at the Bucharest summit. And at that time, the Europeans, Merkel, Sarkozy, they were not in favor of including Ukraine into NATO. They were against. But we were pushed by the Americans, by Bush, to agree against our own interests. And we agreed, it's on paper, that Georgia and Ukraine will become member. The big red line of Putin transgressed. So Putin was very angry. And this war comes now back as a boomerang in our European face. The refugees of Ukraine are in Europe, not in the United States. Inflation is high in Europe, or was high, not in the United States. As you said, the United States is winning. Before, we were buying Russian gas rather cheap. Now, Europeans are buying American gas, more expensive and more polluted. And also buying more gas in other autocracies in the Middle East. So it's not about democracy and human rights. It's about something else.
It is about something else. And I mean, the Europeans are willing to have one of their most important infrastructure projects, Nord Stream pipeline, being blown up Best case scenario, blown up by the Ukrainians who you support. Best case scenario. Worst case, it was a NATO member who actually did it. Worst case, right? Heinz. Did the Europeans wake up?
Yeah, Europeans, yes, not European governments, no. So let me just come to this argument. But let me say, I do think we are in a new bipolarity. So we do have a multipolarity, as both of you mentioned, on a lower level, on the economic level. Of course, we have the BRIC states, and but on the geopolitical level, we have a double bipolarity: China, the US, and also in Europe, Russia, the West. And we have two front lines. And multipolarity as such is not peaceful, because we had multipolarity many times in history in Europe, let alone the multipolarity before the First and before the Second World War. So if we have multipolarity without multilateralism, and multilateralism is declining, we have a very dangerous situation here. Because it was not only Trump who really destroyed most of the multilateral institutions, but Biden did not really revive them, except the Paris Climate Accord. But your question, Pascal, the Europeans, I just want to refer to a survey by the European Council on Foreign Relations sitting in Brussels. They're doing it every 2 years, I guess, and asking European Union citizens if there is a conflict between China and the US. So they didn't even ask military conflict, they only asked conflict. Which side would you take? So China very little, but US not that much either, because 60 to 65% of the Europeans would say they would rather stay neutral. That, of course, was a shock to the transatlantic community. They would not, you imagine, most of them wouldn't say the US, but most of them would say staying neutral. And that's somehow rational, because if you look at the latest NATO documents, they include already China in Article 5 commitments. So if there is a so-called malicious hybrid or cyber attack by China, Article 5 might be invoked. That means European countries would have to go to war against China as well if push comes to shove. So we do have this geopolitical polarization in the world, globally, but also in Europe. So of course you can have trade as well, but geopolitics always trumps trade. As we have seen before the First World War, there was a huge trade between the later war-fighting parties, and interconnectedness and interdependence. And once they made a decision for war, geopolitics dominates.
Tom, the last word goes to you. What is, because you had quite an optimistic tone also about the overall situation. What do you think this year, also with all of its elections that are going to come up, will bring us? Will it go toward de-escalation of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, nobody can predict the future, neither do I. But I'm a bit more optimistic than Heinz, and I do not believe in such a Cold War redux situation. The ideological element is also not there anymore. That was there in the 21st century. Russia will always be the neighbor of Europe, not the United States. Again, Europe. So we have, as Europeans, we have to find views. How do you say?
Modus vivendi.
Kind of modus vivendi to live with Russia, you know. And if this goes well, then Ukraine will automatically benefit from that. But it's not the other way around. You know, it's not if we have good relations with Ukraine that we have good relations with Russia. You know? So we made a mistake. Yeah? We should have got better relations first with Russia and then with Ukraine. So we need a new Euro-Atlantic security order, a rethinking of that, a kind of Helsinki 2, like Heinz proposed, including Russia and including Ukraine. I think it's possible. It will not be for this year or the emotions have to sink in. But at the end of the day, that's, I think, the most realistic. That's what Kissinger would have proposed.
Every great war on this Eurasian continent, which we all share from the two sides of these two large bodies of water, all conflicts always end in some form of conference. The question is, does it happen after a few thousand deaths or after a few million deaths? I hope it goes there rather sooner than later, but I would like to thank you both for the discussion today.
Thank you, Pascal. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Pascal.